This is in fact a list of the 5 jobs I performed in the Army, as the title suggests, but it's also a bit of an oral history of my somewhat unique career. As such, I'll be starting at the beginning. I enlisted as a medic in 2013 with dreams of saving lives and making a difference. Unfortunately, these dreams died soon thereafter, towards the end of AIT, when our platoon sergeant began reading off names and projected duty stations. Private Cooper, Fort Jackson. In that moment, I felt like my life was over. All the work I'd done up to that point was for naught. I knew there were no deployable units there. Hell, there wasn't even an emergency room. As a result of this revelation, I gave up on my career before it had really even started. Fast forward a month or so to me sitting in the medical company building at Jackson, where I suffered another depressing defeat. I sat quietly while my superiors debated whether I would get scooped up by the reception clinic or by the urgent care clinic. I desperately wanted to do patient care, even if it was in a shitty urgent care facility with crazy shift schedules, but obviously I didn't have any say in the matter, and the reception clinic ended up winning the bid. Later that week, I officially began my first job in the Army as a phlebotomist. This might sound weird if you know anything about medics or the fact that there is literally a whole MOS dedicated to blood lab techs, but unfortunately medics can basically be put anywhere within reason. It's sort of a jack-of-all-trades MOS. So to give you an idea of the duties I performed, I need to put the reception medical process into context first. The clinic houses 4 sections for in-processing: the blood lab, optometry, dental, and audiology. Each week, upwards of 1,500 recruits would come in and they'd cycle through the clinic Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. This means up to 500 soldiers per day, split up into 60-man platoons. Each soldier needs 3 to 4 tubes of blood drawn, for which we had to print and sort labels by platoon. There were, on average, 5 to 6 of us working in the lab, and 4 of them were civilians who weren't allowed to do overtime. There were plenty of nights where they took off while we were left to finish the workload. On top of this, it's a new group of tired young people every day, people who have generally never been screamed at before or been under any significant amount of stress. That's a nice way of saying they were all dumb as fuck and every day was like herding cats. That job was truly awful, and I would never wish it on anyone else. After about 1.5 years of wanting to tear my hair out, the clinic leadership decided that they wanted to shift people around to prevent burnout, a point which I had reached less than 6 months into being a phlebotomist. Their solution was to move me into what could be characterized as an even worse position. I became an optometry tech on the other side of the clinic, something that was easily the most mind-numbing duty I've ever performed. The first step in the optometry process was to get a visual acuity test for each soldier. Now, this sounds easy, but like I said, all these kids are morons and they haven't had any sleep, so it went something like this. Alright soldier, come on in and stand on the red line. No, the red line. Alright, now cover your left eye. No, your left eye. And now read line 8. No, read line 8. It was enough to drive you insane. I also worked with another machine that took a photo of the geography of your eye, or some shit like that. I can't really remember what it was called, but that was step 2, and it wasn't so bad. Now anyway, from there we had to place glasses orders, including the inserts for eye pro and gas masks. Each order was placed into the system, and there was absolutely no way to speed up the process. After ordering them, we'd pick them up from the shop up the hill and sort them by name, and then by platoon, so they could be picked up. I thought this was the final nail in my career's coffin, but a few months into it, a new NCO took over the optometry side, and he completely changed the course of my life. You see, by this point, I was totally checked out. I was going to ride out the rest of my contract and go home. But this guy was the real deal. He'd done all the things I wanted to do when I joined, and because of him, I started to care again. No one else in optometry cared that I wasn't developing as a medic. None of my leadership up to this point cared that I was losing the skills that I had worked hard for. And they outright refused to send me for additional training that would benefit my MOS. Their reason? Because he's in optometry. Now, Sergeant Jovanovic did not like this answer. Not long after he started there and realized what was going on, he came into the office and said that if I wanted to re-enlist, there was an opportunity to trade me out to the aid station and that I had until the end of the day to decide. Now, this sounds great, and it was great, but I still had to wrestle with some pretty complicated feelings. Do I give up relative comfort and predictability for something new? What if I'm not good at it? What if I hate this job too? Why shouldn't I just ride out this contract and get the hell out of this lonely, miserable profession? To Despite these anxieties, I overcame them and agreed to move to the aid station. It was one of the best decisions I've ever made. Working in the aid station was a blast, and to fully communicate that, I need to add a little more context. You see, 68 whiskeys are really only technically qualified as EMT-Bs, which is the real-world equivalent of a bus driver that can do CPR and administer oxygen. However, when you work under a doctor or a physician assistant, you are working under their license, so they can teach you to do just about anything they're comfortable with. And let me tell you, the PAs at the aid station were comfortable with a lot. They were cool as fuck, and due to the patient load, it was necessary to let us do more. We'd see upwards of 150 people a day with 2 to 4 PAs and 4 to 6 medics. It was mostly manageable, but every now and then there were some freak days where people were out for training or whatever and we got kind of screwed. I think the most patients I ever saw in a day was around 30, but I got to treat everything from colds to STDs and perform a few procedures like throwing in sutures, removing ingrown toenails, and draining cysts. It was truly rad. But all good things must come to an end, and I did eventually start to burn out. I decided to re-enlist to go to Hawaii, essentially on a whim, without knowing that the 25th hadn't deployed in like 4 years. This was certainly a critical oversight on my part, but one that I don't regret with the benefit of hindsight. In 2017, I arrived at Schofield Barracks and was scooped up by the 121 Infantry Battalion, the Gimlets. I spent some time in the medic platoon in HHC, but I don't really count that as my next job because the whole time I was begging to go to the line and doing my best to avoid them or any of the bullshit they wanted me to do. I eventually got my wish when I met another NCO who changed my life. I was at a CPR recertification class when I met Sergeant Gonzalez. He was the senior medic for Charlie Company, and the first things he said to me were, "Who are you, and do you want to go to the line?" I said yes before he'd really even finished his sentence, and over the next month or so, I nagged at him constantly for updates every time he stopped by the battalion aid station. I finally became a platoon medic when 121 went to JRTC in June of 2017, and I was immediately thrown into the fire. I'd left with Headquarters Company and transferred to Charlie Company when we got to Louisiana. I took over Sergeant Gonzalez's old platoon, 3rd Platoon, and I had some pretty big shoes to fill. Now, as you probably guessed from listening to the rest of this story, I didn't have a fucking clue what I was doing in an infantry unit. But the thing that saved me was my time at the aid station at Jackson and the fact that I wanted to be there and I wanted to take care of those guys. Because of my clinical knowledge, I gained their trust pretty quickly and the rest kind of just fell into line. Even though things only really amounted to playing laser guns in the woods for a couple of years, I look back on my time with them very fondly, and I wouldn't trade that time with them to have gone to a unit that deployed. Also, without them, I never would have discovered my passion as an artist. I say that because during that first training event, I decided to take my camera with me to the field. I photographed them during our downtime and fell in love with the idea of the candid photo. After that, I took my camera with me everywhere, all through our training in Thailand, the Philippines, South Korea, the Big Island, and the Kahukus. I was shooting every chance that I got, and eventually people started to notice. I'd been on the line for about a year or so when the brigade public affairs officer commented on one of my Instagram posts and told me to come find him, so I did. Lieutenant D-Boy was yet another leader that changed my life. This guy is basically a rock star in the public affairs realm, and I think he even has an Emmy. But anyway, he tells me that I have talent and that he wants to make me 121's public affairs rep. But it's generally an E5 position, so I'd have to get promoted or he'd find a way to make an exception. I was really hesitant to leave my platoon at the time, and we ended up shelving the idea. Several months passed, and then out of the blue, the headquarters first sergeant asked me to come see him in his office. Come to find out that nobody at battalion knew who I was or where all these photos had been coming from. One of them had been even turned into a poster in the stairwell. Turned out that my company commander had been keeping me a secret that whole time because he didn't want anyone to steal me. So again, I was asked if I wanted to leave the line and become a unit public affairs rep. I decided that even though I loved the line, I needed to change, so I said yes. My first training event as a photographer was in Alaska, and I think those photos are probably still some of my best work. But even before I took those heavy hitters, Brigade was breathing down my neck for training photos. We hadn't really done shit in the first couple of days. The only training they'd gotten was in the post theater, and it was a slideshow about how to properly wear the Army's cold weather system. So on the way back to the barracks, I took a photograph of my friend Nolan making a snow angel. It was an absolute hit with Brigade and a few levels above it. The image of a soldier from Hawaii making a snow angel in Alaska is pure gold. But the senior NCOs on the ground with me did not agree. They felt like the photo was saying that the whole trip was a waste and that 121 was just dicking around instead of training. This was the first of a few disagreements in that same vein. From there, my interest in the candid photograph became a bit of an obsession, and I explored it for about a year before my enlistment ran out. During that time, one of my photos was published on the cover of Infantry magazine, and several other photos made their way to the Army's Instagram or to the front page of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser. Despite my success and a phone call from the Sergeant Major in charge of public affairs for the entire Army asking who he needed to kill to get me to reclass, I decided that I didn't want to tell the Army's story anymore, and I wanted to grow a beard, so I elected to ETS. Since then, I've continued to work in the medical field in a smaller capacity while I dick around with this whole social media thing. I've occasionally pondered what ifs, but it's nice to know that I'd be successful no matter which path I'd chosen as a content creator. At any rate, and in an effort to close this thing out, I'd like to thank you for listening this long. If you've served, I hope you found something to relate to. And if you haven't, I hope you found a new sense of understanding towards service members and veterans. I look forward to sharing more, and if you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe. And lastly, as an additional note, after writing this script, I realized that at 3 separate crucial moments in my life, a leader recognized my worth and my talent and made an effort to change my life for the better. I can't express how much that means to me and how much it's impacted my life. Thank you for putting me in a position where I could thrive. I wouldn't be here without you.